Parents kicked me out of the house for their golden child and then demanded that I keep paying my rent and bills, and I did. Jake had always been the afterthought. He knew it, his parents knew it, and most painfully, his older brother, Alex, knew it. Growing up, the favoritism was never subtle. Their mother spoke about Alex like he was a once-in-a-generation prodigy, an exceptional human being whose mere existence was a gift to the world. Jake, on the other hand, was just there, an extra, a shadow in the periphery of the family's grand narrative. Every achievement of Alex's, no matter how minor, was celebrated as though he had split the atom. A passing grade in a difficult class? Their mother would gush about his intelligence for weeks. A mediocre job offer? She would tell the neighbors how proud she was of her son's hard work. Meanwhile, Jake had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. When he graduated with honors, there was no family celebration, no proud Facebook post from their mother. She merely nodded, saying, "That's nice, Jake." It wasn't just about achievements, either. The family dynamics were structured around Alex's needs. If Alex wanted the bigger room, he got it. If he needed money, their parents provided. When he struggled in college, their mother was on the phone with him every night, reassuring him that he was still brilliant and that it wasn't his fault. When Jake struggled, he was told to figure it out, to be independent, to not be a burden. Then came the moment when their parents announced their retirement plans. Jake had assumed that this would be the point where things finally changed. Maybe, just maybe, now that they were older, his parents would see the effort he put into being a responsible, independent adult. He was wrong. Instead, they asked him to move back home. But not out of love, not because they wanted to spend more time with their younger son. No, it was because Alex wasn't ready to have kids yet. Their mother said it so matter-of-factly, as if Jake's life was an afterthought in the grand scheme of Alex's future. "We just need you to help out around the house," she had said, her voice casual, like she was doing him a favor. "Until Alex settles down and starts a family. Then, of course, things will change." Jake knew exactly what that meant. He was a placeholder, a temporary fix, until Alex, the golden son, finally gave them the grandchildren they were waiting for. Jake was expected to be the one keeping everything running. And because he was so used to being the responsible one, the dependable one, he agreed. That was his mistake. At first, he thought it wouldn't be so bad. He paid rent, because of course he had to pay rent. His parents had been supporting Alex financially for years, bailing him out of his reckless spending and poor decisions. But Jake? Jake was an adult, and adults paid their way. He covered expenses, managed household chores, and even started remodeling parts of the house to make it more comfortable for their aging parent. He fixed leaking pipes, repainted rooms, replaced worn-out appliances, things that would have cost thousands if they had hired someone. Did anyone thank him? No. Instead, his mother would make comments about how Alex would have done things differently, or how maybe Alex should have been the one to take care of things. As if Alex, the same man who could barely keep his own finances together, would have somehow been better at managing a household. Jake swallowed his frustration and kept going. He kept the house running while his brother lived in another state, spending money like it was water, making reckless financial decisions with no consequences. Their parents never questioned Alex's lifestyle. If he ran out of money, they would send him some. If he made a bad investment, they would sympathize. But when Jake so much as mentioned needing a break, he was met with disapproval. "You're single, Jake," his mother would say with a sigh, as if she was tired of having to explain it to him. "You have the time. Alex is busy." Busy doing what? Living his life, making mistakes without consequences, being free. And yet, in their parents' eyes, Jake was the one who was failing. They would never say it outright, but it was clear in the way they spoke to him, the way they dismissed his efforts. His life was on hold for their convenience, and they didn't even have the decency to acknowledge it. One evening, as Jake sat at the kitchen table after another long day of work, his mother made an offhand comment that nearly made him snap. "You know, we're just waiting for Alex to settle down," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Once he has kids, things will really fall into place." Jake clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to ask, "What about me? What about my life?" But he already knew the answer. His life was secondary. It always had been. And so he stayed silent, because in his family, silence was the only thing expected of him. When Alex lost his job, their mother reacted as if he had won the lottery. "This is perfect," she announced, beaming as if the universe had finally aligned in the way it was always meant to. "Now you can come home and we can all be together again." Jake had been the one keeping everything running for years, paying rent, covering bills, fixing what was broken, and making sure his parents lived comfortably. Meanwhile, Alex had been living in another state, spending recklessly, making bad decisions, and never facing any consequences. But now that he had lost his job, their mother saw it not as a failure, but as an opportunity. Jake didn't have to be told outright what this meant. He already knew. He had always known, deep down, but now it was undeniable. He was just a placeholder, a stand-in until the son they actually cared about needed them again. Then came the inevitable conversation. His mother sat him down at the kitchen table, her tone gentle but firm, like she was explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. "Jake, honey, now that Alex is coming back, we need to make space for him and his wife. They need the room." The words hit like a slap, but she wasn't finished. "Of course, we'll need you to keep helping out. We still expect you to cover the bills for a little while. Just until Alex gets back on his feet." It took Jake a moment to process what she was saying. They were asking him to leave his own home, the house he had maintained, the one he had poured his time and money into, so that Alex, who had done nothing, could take his place. And not only that, but they still expected him to keep paying for everything after he was gone. His father, sitting across from him, barely looked up from his newspaper. "It's just for a little while," he muttered, as if it were no big deal. Jake's stomach twisted. There was no discussion, no thought given to what this would mean for him. He wasn't being asked, he was being told. And the worst part was, they genuinely believed he would agree. They assumed, as they always had, that he would just go along with it, that he would accept whatever scraps they decided to throw at him. Jake stared at his mother, waiting for her to realize how absurd this was. But she just smiled, like she was proud of herself for coming up with such a simple solution. That was the moment it hit him. He had spent his entire life trying to earn their love, their approval, their respect. But it had never mattered. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he worked, he was nothing more than a backup plan. His life had never been his own, it had always been shaped around Alex's needs, Alex's failures, Alex's future. And he was done. Instead of arguing, instead of begging for fairness, Jake simply nodded. "Okay." His mother beamed. "I knew you'd understand." But she didn't understand. Not yet. Jake packed his things that night. He didn't tell them where he was going, didn't give them a chance to talk him out of it. He quietly gathered everything he owned, everything that hadn't already been sacrificed to keep their house running, and left. And then, he did something he should have done years ago. He blocked them. On his phone, on social media, on every possible way they could contact him. He erased them from his life as cleanly and efficiently as if they had never existed. For the first time in years, he felt free. No more guilt. No more expectations. No more being the placeholder while waiting for Alex to come back and take over. He walked away and never looked back. Jake had been gone for months, and in that time, his life had finally begun to feel like his own. No more obligations, no more being the backup plan, no more bending over backward for a family that had never truly cared about him. He had cut all ties, blocked their numbers, and for the first time, he was free. Or so he thought. The call came unexpectedly. It wasn't from his parents. They were still blocked, as they always would be. It was from his uncle, his father's younger brother. Unlike the rest of the family, Uncle David had always been different. He was the only one who ever seemed to notice how unfairly Jake was treated, though he had never interfered. "Jake, listen," Uncle David said, his voice heavy. "You need to know what's really going on." Jake had no intention of getting sucked back in, but there was something in his uncle's tone that made him pause. "Alex has been jobless for 6 months. Not a few weeks, 6 months. Jake felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "What?" "The whole time you were there," Uncle David continued, "he wasn't working. He lost his job months ago, but your parents didn't want you to know. They've been covering for him, sending him thousands of dollars. The money you thought was going to household expenses? It was going to Alex." Jake sat in stunned silence. Thousands of dollars. Money that he had struggled to provide. Money he had assumed was being used for groceries, utilities, the house. "They even took out a second mortgage," Uncle David said, lowering his voice. "They're on the verge of foreclosure. They thought they'd be able to cover it, but now they can't. And guess who they're calling to fix it?" Jake let out a bitter laugh. Of course. He should have known. He had known, deep down. It had never made sense. Why his parents had suddenly been so insistent on him moving out when Alex came back, why they had expected him to keep paying even after he was gone. It was never about fairness or logic. It was about desperation. They had been drowning in debt, and instead of telling him, instead of asking for help in a way that might have made him care, they had continued to lie, manipulate, and use him. And now they were out of options. Uncle David sighed. "They're going to call you, Jake. They think you'll come running, like always. They think you'll fix this. Jake's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He didn't need to check to know who it was. He let it ring. Then he let it ring again. And again. Eventually, he picked up, not because he cared, but because he wanted to hear them say it. His mother's voice was strained, a forced attempt at warmth. "Jakey, sweetheart, how have you been?" Straight to manipulation. No acknowledgement of what they had done. No apology. "I know things have been tense," she continued, "but we really need to talk. It's about the house." Of course it was. "Alex is struggling," she said, as if that was the real issue. "Your father and we made some mistakes. We thought we were helping, but now the bank is going to take the house," Jake finished for her. "Because you spent everything on Alex and lied to me." Silence. "You knew," his mother finally said, voice small. "Yeah," Jake said coldly. "I know everything now." More silence. Then came the real reason for the call. "Jake, sweetheart, we just need a little help. Just enough to get back on our feet. If you could cover the mortgage for a few months." Jake laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. "You want me to fix this? After you threw me out so Alex could take my place?" His mother made a choked noise, but before she could launch into another excuse, Jake cut her off. "I'll make you one offer," he said. "I'll pay off the mortgage. I'll take full ownership of the house. But Alex pays rent, or he leaves." The stunned silence was more satisfying than it should have been. "Jake, sweetheart," his mother finally stammered, "you can't." "I can," he said. "And I will. Those are my terms. Take it or lose the house." He could hear her struggling for words, the realization hitting her all at once. For the first time in his life, he had the power. And he wasn't going to let them forget it. The moment Jake made his offer, Alex exploded. "A greedy bastard, that's what you are," he roared. "This house is my birthright. Mine." Jake barely reacted. He had expected this. Alex had been handed everything his entire life. Why would he ever believe there could be consequences? His parents jumped in immediately, their voices sharp with disapproval. "But not for Alex. Never for Alex." "Jake, don't be so heartless," their mother pleaded. "Your brother is going through a hard time. He just needs a little help." Help. The same word they always used to justify taking from Jake and giving to Alex. The same excuse they had whispered to themselves for years as they drained their accounts, took out loans, lied, and begged for more time, because Alex needed them. Jake had nothing left to say. He turned and walked away, ignoring his mother's desperate calls, his father's disappointed sigh, and Alex's continued shouting. That was the last time he saw any of them. Months passed. He ignored the messages, the emails, the increasingly frantic calls. He didn't need to check to know what was happening. The foreclosure was no longer just a threat, it was real. The bank was moving in, and Alex still wasn't doing anything to stop it. Jake didn't think about them. He had a new life, one that didn't involve fixing their messes. Until, one night, his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, until he saw the name attached. Megan. Alex's wife. "Curious, and maybe a little cruel," he answered. There was silence on the line for a moment, and then, "Jake, please," she said, her voice breaking. I need your help." Jake leaned back in his chair, saying nothing. He had no intention of helping, but he was interested in what she had to say. She took his silence as permission to continue. "I don't know what else to do," Megan admitted, her voice shaking. "The house is gone. It's really happening, Jake. The bank sent people over today. And Alex," she let out a short, bitter laugh. "He doesn't care." Jake closed his eyes. "Of course, he didn't. I thought he was trying," Megan continued, the words spilling out faster now. "He kept telling me he had a plan, that he was figuring it out, but all he does is go out drinking, wasting what little money we don't have. He's maxed out all our credit cards, Jake. He refuses to get a job. He says he's too good for the ones that are hiring." Jake exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening on his phone. Megan kept going, her voice becoming more frantic. "I can't take it anymore," she whispered. I thought I married a man, but I married a child. Your parents won't even admit how bad it is. They just keep making excuses, saying he's under a lot of stress." "Stress? Jake, I'm the one who's been selling my own jewelry just to keep food in the fridge. And Alex," her voice cracked. "He just laughs. He laughs at me when I tell him we're running out of money. He says it's not his problem. That someone will fix it." Jake opened his mouth, then closed it. He had spent his entire life cleaning up Alex's messes. And now Alex had run out of options. For the first time, there was no one left to save him. And Jake? He had never felt more satisfied. Jake hadn't planned on stepping in. He had washed his hands of his family's mess, moved on, and refused to let them drag him back into their chaos. But when the foreclosure became official, and the bank prepared to take the house, he saw an opportunity. Not to save them, to take back what was rightfully his. With cold efficiency, Jake bought the house outright. He didn't tell his parents. He didn't tell Alex. He let the reality hit them when they realized that the home they had once thrown him out of now legally belonged to him. His mother called first. "Jake, sweetheart, I just heard." "It's mine now," he interrupted. "I own it. And if Alex wants to live here, he pays rent. No exceptions." The silence stretched. He could practically hear the gears turning in her head, searching for a way to manipulate him like before. Then came the inevitable. "Honey, Alex is trying. You know he's been struggling. Can't you just—" "No," she gasped, as if the very idea of Jake refusing to bend was something new and terrifying. Jake stayed firm. "You kicked me out for Alex. Now you get to live with that choice." She tried again. "But this is his home. You know it is." Jake let out a low chuckle. "Not anymore." And he hung up. Alex, of course, refused to pay. He scoffed at the very idea of giving his little brother money. "You're seriously making me pay rent?" "Me?" Alex sneered when Jake delivered the contract. "This is my birthright, and you know it." "No," Jake said simply. "It's my property. Either pay or leave." And for months, Alex made excuses. "My paycheck is late. I'm looking for jobs, but the market is bad. Come on, man. It's not like you need the money." Jake didn't argue. He just waited. And when the deadline hit, he handed Alex an official eviction notice. 3 months later, Alex was gone. Not because he had finally taken responsibility for his life, but because the law had forced him out. Their parents were livid. His mother screamed at him over the phone. "How could you do this to your own brother?" Jake only laughed. "Funny, I was wondering the same thing when you did it to me." With nowhere else to go, Alex and their parents landed at Uncle Rick's house. At first, their mother acted like it was just a temporary setback, promising that everything would be fine soon. But Rick wasn't Jake. He had no patience for freeloaders. Within weeks, Rick started complaining. "Your brother's a damn leech, Jake," he grumbled over the phone one evening. "Sits around all day, making messes he doesn't clean up. Still doesn't have a job. He's got your parents running around like his servants." Jake smirked. "Sounds about right. Well, I'm done." Rick's voice hardened. "He's got 2 weeks and then he's out." It didn't take even that long. Megan had finally had enough. She had spent months watching Alex spiral, watching him refuse to take any accountability, watching him party while she scrambled to keep them afloat, watching him laugh when she begged him to act like an adult. And when she realized nothing would ever change, she left. She filed for divorce, took what little money she had left, and started over. Jake found out through a single text message from her. "Thank you for making me see what I refused to admit. I deserve better. And so did you." Meanwhile, Jake thrived. The house, the real family home, the one he had maintained for years, was finally his. He remodeled, erasing every trace of the life his parents had built around Alex. He transformed one of the empty rooms into a gym, investing in himself the way he had once invested in them. And most importantly, he built a life that was his. No more waiting. No more sacrificing. No more being a backup plan. And when he finally got down on one knee and proposed to his girlfriend, Sarah, he knew. He was never going back. Jake never expected to hear from his father again. After everything, after being used, discarded, and betrayed, he had assumed that chapter of his life was closed. He had moved on. Built something for himself. For the first time, he had a real home, a loving partner, and a future that he controlled. Then, one evening, his phone rang. The number was familiar. His father. Jake let it ring, considering whether to ignore it. But something inside him told him to pick up. The moment he answered, he knew. His father wasn't calling to lecture him, to guilt-trip him, or to berate him for what he had done to Alec. No. His father was begging. Jake, the old man's voice cracked. Please, son. We need your help. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything. He just waited. And then, for the first time in his life, he heard the words he never thought he'd hear. We were wrong about you. His father's voice was hoarse, drained of all the arrogance it once carried. You were always the responsible one. Jake exhaled slowly. He should have felt triumphant, vindicated. But all he felt was tired. His father kept talking. Rick kicked us out. Said he's not our caretaker, and that we need to stand on our own 2 feet. Alex ran off to Florida, just disappeared. No job, no plan, just left. We don't have anywhere to go, Jake. Jake held up a hand, even though his father couldn't see him. Stop. Silence. His father's breathing was heavy, uneven. Jake knew what was coming next. The plea. The attempt to pull him back into their web. We just need. I'll make you a deal, Jake interrupted. His father immediately fell silent. You can stay, Jake said flatly. But not in the house. I have an apartment above the garage. It's small, but it's warm, and it's yours, under 3 conditions. His father hesitated, then asked cautiously, What are they? 1. You pay rent. Even if it's just a little. You're not living off me for free. Okay. 2. You never mention Alex to me again. No guilt, no excuses, no he's struggling speeches. He's gone. A pause. Then, fine. Jake took a deep breath. And 3. You admit, fully admit, that you treated me like garbage. That you threw me away for him. That I was never good enough for you, and it had nothing to do with what I did, and everything to do with your own selfishness. Silence. Jake almost thought his father had hung up. But then, in a voice so small it was barely recognizable, his father whispered. We did. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was the closest thing Jake was ever going to get. All right, Jake said. You can move in tomorrow. His father exhaled sharply, like the weight of the world had just been lifted off his shoulders. Thank you, son. Jake hung up. It wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about power. For the first time in his life, Jake held all the power. His parents moved in the next day. They didn't complain about the small space. They didn't try to argue. They knew that this was their last chance, their final option. And Jake made sure they understood. He wasn't their son anymore. He was their landlord. Meanwhile, his life was better than ever. Sarah had just given him the greatest news of all. They were expecting their first child. A son. And as Jake placed a hand on Sarah's stomach, feeling the tiny life growing inside, he made a silent vow. My son will never feel like a backup plan. He will never be the forgotten one. He will never have to fight for my love. Because Jake knew exactly what it felt like to be the child who didn't matter. And he would never be like his parents.